On the morning of March 4th, 2026, a law firm in Asheville, North Carolina, unsealed a document that had been sitting in a climate-controlled vault for nearly 4 years, untouched, unread, and unknown to every person who believed they controlled the Crane family fortune. The document was 41 pages long. It carried 3 signatures, 2 independent witnesses, and a notarial seal dated November 12, 2022. By noon that same day, the Crane Foundation's entire board of directors had received certified copies, and by evening, 3 of the most expensive estate attorneys in the southeastern United States were on retainer, scrambling to find any possible flaw in its language. They would find none. The document transferred ownership of a privately held estate called Hollowstone, a 1,200-acre property concealed deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, to a 24-year-old graduate student named Clara Ashford. Nobody in the room had seen that coming. Least of all the people who had already spent 18 months trying to claim it for themselves. Who was Eleanor Crane? To understand why this inheritance detonated like a depth charge inside one of America's most powerful philanthropic dynasties, you first have to understand who Eleanor Ashford Crane actually was. Not the version printed in Forbes profiles or engraved on library dedications, but the real woman. Eleanor Crane spent 50 years building the Crane Foundation into a force that touched public education, indigenous land rights, and environmental preservation across 11 states. She was sharp, strategic, and notoriously private. She never married, she gave no major interviews after 1991. She rejected honorary degrees, avoided galas, and was described by a former colleague as the most deliberate human being I have ever encountered. Every action she took was calculated to produce a specific result, including her own death. She passed away in January 2026 at the age of 83. The public memorial drew sitting senators, 2 former presidents, and a crowd of thousands in Asheville who lined the streets in quiet tribute. The official eulogy focused on endowments, grants, and generational impact. It was appropriately grand. But the people who truly knew Eleanor understood that her real life had never been lived in a boardroom or at a press podium. It had been lived at Hollowstone, the estate. No one was supposed to know about. Hollowstone was not listed on any foundation asset registry. It did not appear in Eleanor's publicly disclosed financial statements. For decades, it was buried beneath a property management LLC incorporated in Delaware, a company whose name meant nothing and whose paper trail ended cleanly at a post office box. The estate sat on land originally purchased in 1974, the year Eleanor turned 31, and watched the foundation she had built from nothing begin to outgrow her vision for it. The property was remote by design, 40 minutes from the nearest paved road, and accessible only by a gravel track that wound through dense second-growth forest before opening into a wide, sloping meadow framed by ancient hardwoods. The main house was built from local riverstone and reclaimed timber. It was large enough to be comfortable, small enough to feel human. There was no guest wing, no executive conference room, no infrastructure for hosting events. There was a library containing over 3,000 books, a recording studio Eleanor had installed in the mid-1990s, and a garden she tended herself every spring until her hands no longer cooperated. Former staff who signed strict non-disclosure agreements described a woman completely transformed by geography. In the office, Eleanor was measured and executive. At Hollowstone, she cooked her own meals, walked the ridge trails at dawn, and spent long evenings in the library writing things she never published. She did not bring colleagues to Hollowstone. She did not bring donors. She brought silence, and she brought it deliberately. Inside those stone walls, Eleanor had assembled something that no foundation grant could ever replicate: a private archive, 40 years of handwritten journals, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations with activists, scientists, and historians who spoke freely because they trusted that what they said would never become a press release. Correspondence with figures whose public positions and private beliefs were, at times, dramatically different. And something even more fragile, her own honest accounting of the choices she had made, including the ones she regretted. She knew what this archive was worth. She also knew exactly what would happen to it if it fell into the wrong hands. The campaign that almost worked. Long before Eleanor's death, the Crane Foundation's board of directors had begun quietly repositioning itself for the post-Eleanor era. The board was led in practice by Warren Hargrove, Eleanor's second cousin by marriage. a man whose family had contributed seed capital to the foundation in its earliest years and who had spent 3 decades leveraging that history into influence. Warren was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was simply a man who believed that legacy was primarily a real estate transaction. To him, Hollowstone represented an extraordinary untapped asset, 1,200 acres of pristine Blue Ridge terrain with significant development potential, and more importantly, a powerful personal mythology that could be monetized as a heritage tourism destination. By the autumn of 2024, Warren had quietly engaged a landscape architecture firm and commissioned a feasibility study. The concept was polished, an Eleanor Crane cultural reserve, complete with guided trail experiences, a boutique accommodation retreat, and curated public access to a carefully edited selection of Eleanor's personal writings. He had already spoken privately with 2 documentary production companies. He was so confident of success that he told a colleague, in a conversation that would later be corroborated by 3 people in the room, that the Hollowstone question was already resolved. It was not. What Warren did not know, what nobody except 4 people on Earth knew, was that Eleanor had seen this type of thinking coming from a considerable distance. She had watched Warren for years with the same analytical patience she applied to every problem, and she had responded the way she always responded to a threat, quietly, thoroughly, and years in advance. The document that changed everything. The legal instrument unsealed on March 4, 2026, was not Eleanor's standard estate will. That document, the one Warren and his attorneys had reviewed and accepted, dealt with the foundation's endowments, board succession protocols, and various charitable bequests. It was entirely standard and entirely expected. What was not expected was a second, entirely separate private covenant, executed outside the foundation's legal structure, governed purely by civil property law, and drafted with the kind of precision that comes from hiring attorneys who specialize in making things impossible to overturn. The covenant contained a provision that Eleanor's personal attorney, a woman named Ruth Okafor, described later as the cleanest piece of exclusionary language I have reviewed in 30 years of estate law. It was a single, devastating clause that barred the Crane Foundation, its board, its affiliated organizations, and any member of the Hargrove family line from any form of claim, access, or managerial authority over Hollowstone, in perpetuity. The rationale Eleanor embedded in the covenant's preamble was characteristically direct. She wrote that the estate was a place of unfiltered private memory, not institutional heritage, and that its purpose was preservation without performance. She further stated that anyone whose interest in the property was primarily commercial or reputational would, by definition, fail to understand what it was for. Hollowstone, in its entirety, the land, the structures, the archive, and the legal authority to determine its future, was transferred to Clara Ashford. Why Clara? Clara Ashford was completing a doctoral dissertation in archival history at the University of North Carolina. She was 24. She had no public profile, no social media presence beyond a dormant professional account, and no institutional affiliation with the Crane Foundation. Most people who worked at the foundation had never heard her name. But Eleanor had known Clara since she was 9 years old. Clara's mother, Patricia Ashford, was Eleanor's niece, a relationship distant enough that it carried no dynastic weight, but close enough that the two had maintained a genuine, unpublicized friendship. Clara grew up visiting Eleanor irregularly, spending long summer afternoons in conversations that veered from history to ecology to the mechanics of institutional power. Eleanor had never treated her like a child to be managed. She had treated her like a person worth talking to. In the summers of 2019, 2020, and 2021, Clara had come to Hollowstone. These were not social visits. They were working visits, and what Clara worked on was the archive. Under Eleanor's direct instruction, she spent weeks cataloging, cross-referencing, and creating finding aids for materials that had never been systematically organized. She was not there because she was ambitious. She was there because Eleanor had observed, over many years, that Clara was the only person in her extended orbit who approached historical material with reverence rather than strategy. Eleanor's recorded explanation, found on a cassette tape stored with the covenant documents, was precise. Clara understands that the value of a private record is not what it confirms about a public person. It is what it reveals about a human one. She will not sell what she finds here. She will not perform what she learns. She will simply keep it honest, and that is the only thing I have ever asked of anyone. Postam Bayaneraten. The fallout. Warren Hargrove's response to the covenant was immediate and predictable. Within 72 hours of the document being unsealed, his legal team had filed a formal challenge in Buncombe County Superior Court, arguing that the covenant violated public interest statutes governing charitable estates. The argument was thin, and experienced observers noted it immediately. What followed over the next several weeks was more revealing than the lawsuit itself. Foundation board members who had previously been allies publicly distanced themselves from Warren's legal campaign as it became clear the covenant was bulletproof. 2 board members resigned. A long-form investigative piece published by a regional newspaper detailed the timeline of Warren's feasibility study, the name of the landscape architecture firm, and the dates of his conversations with documentary producers, all of which preceded Eleanor's death by more than a year, establishing that he had been treating the estate as a future acquisition while Eleanor was still alive. Public opinion did not bend in Warren's direction. Ruth Okafor gave a single, brief interview to the Associated Press in which she stated only that Eleanor had anticipated every legal challenge to the covenant and addressed each one with considerable foresight. She declined to elaborate. She did not need to. Clara, for her part, said almost nothing publicly for the first 2 months. She did not grant interviews. She did not post statements. And she retained her own legal counsel and allowed the covenant's language to speak for itself. When she finally did speak, it was at a small public forum on archival ethics hosted by her university in late April 2026. She was not there to talk about Hollowstone specifically. She was there as a doctoral candidate presenting a portion of her research, but near the end of her remarks, she said something that circulated widely. The people who built things quietly are always in danger of being redefined loudly by the people who arrive after them. The best protection against that isn't publicity, it's documentation, and knowing whose hands you leave it in. The room was quiet for a moment before the applause began. What Hollowstone represents now. By the summer of 2026, the legal challenge had collapsed. Warren Hargrove withdrew the lawsuit without comment. The Crane Foundation, under its restructured board, issued a formal statement acknowledging the covenant's validity and wishing Clara well in her stewardship. Clara did not announce a development plan for Hollowstone. She did not create a website, launch a brand, or invite journalists for a tour. What she did, according to her doctoral advisor and a handful of colleagues she trusted, was return to the work Eleanor had always intended for that place, finishing the archive. What she will ultimately do with what she finds there, whether any portion of it will ever be made public and on what terms, remains entirely her decision. That was always the point. Eleanor Crane spent 50 years building a public legacy. She spent 40 years building a private one. She understood with unusual clarity that the private one was the more honest, the more fragile, and the more worth protecting. She chose her guardian not for her ambition, her connections, or her institutional standing. She chose her because she had proven, across years of quiet work in a stone house in the mountains, that she understood the difference between preserving something and possessing it. There is a pattern embedded in this story that is worth sitting with. In almost every generation, the people who accumulate power do so by understanding that visibility is leverage. They maneuver toward resources because resources become platforms and platforms become permanence. This is not unusual, and it is simply how institutional power reproduces itself. What is unusual is the person who looks at all of that and chooses differently, who accepts responsibility without accepting the spotlight, who inherits not because they fought for it, but because the person doing the leaving saw something in them that ambition had never touched. Eleanor Crane left Hollowstone to Clara Ashford because she recognized something rare, a person who wanted to understand the past without rewriting it for personal advantage. And in doing so, Eleanor made her most lasting argument, that the most important things we build in a lifetime are not the ones we show the world. They are the ones we trust the right person to keep. The question that lingers, now that the legal dust has settled and the stone walls of Hollowstone stand quietly in the Blue Ridge fog, is one that Eleanor herself likely asked in that library on many long evenings. In a world that rewards being seen, what extraordinary courage does it take to choose to simply be real?